All right, we are getting started. People are coming in. We'll give it another minute or so for folks to arrive, and then we can get started. Welcome, everyone. As you're coming in, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where you're visiting from. Uh, and we'll get started in just a few seconds. All right. Good evening and welcome to JWA's Film Club. I am Betsy Moore, Director of Programs at the Jewish Women's Archive. I am so happy to be with you for tonight's Film Club. As I said earlier, please say hello in the chat if you like. Make sure you're chatting to everyone, and please add your questions to the conversation. We are delighted to be able to continue gathering together from all over the world for meaningful conversation and learning. A few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. The Film Club is just one aspect of JWA's work, along with our other virtual programs, our encyclopedia, our podcast, our blog, and many other projects. And I hope you will check out jwa.org to explore the full range of programs and resources that we offer. Tonight, we are honored to feature Professor Rachel Harris, who will be speaking about the film The Women's Balcony. Rachel is the Gimelstob Chair, serving as Director of Jewish Studies and Professor of Cinema and Media Studies at Florida Atlantic University. She is the author of the fabulously titled Warriors, Witches, Whores: Women in Israeli Cinema, as well as An Ideological Death, Suicide in Israeli Literature, and the co-edited Casting a Giant Shadow, The Transnational Shaping of Israeli Cinema, which won a Best Book Award. Along with several other books. She is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Jewish Identities. We are also delighted to have Professor Helene Meyers as guest moderator tonight, filling in for Judith Rosenbaum, who is away at a tech-free retreat. Helene is Professor Emerita of English at Southwestern University, where she held the McManus University Chair. When she's not writing and speaking about American Jewish film, literature, and culture, she's helping us humanities types find career pathways that feed the body and soul. Her fourth book, Movie Made Jews, An American Tradition, was published by Rutgers University Press in fall of 2021. We are delighted to have both of them with us tonight. And Rachel, I invite you to take it away.
Thank you so much for inviting me here this evening. I'm really delighted to be here to talk about one of my favorite films of all time. I am actually not going to talk about the film in the presentation that I'm going to do because I'd like to open that to the audience to engage in conversation with that as we move into the discussion part of the program. But I wanted to give some kind of contextual history to help us understand how we can engage with the material from the women's balcony and kind of see the making of it in the context of the history of representation, both of women and particularly of Mizrahi cinema. So I'm going to sort of open up to a presentation, and then from the presentation part, we can move into more of a discussion specifically about the film. I'm going to share my screen and hope technology is on my side today. Great. It seems to be working, which is always a good sign. So today I wanted to talk about the stages in which we came to understand the context in which this film is being made. with me. So Jewish immigration to Israel after the state of Israel was created really exploded in the first 4 years immediately after the state. This is a whole trail of the immigration numbers, and you can see in the 90s things like the immigration from the former Soviet Union. But you can really see in the first 4 years that you're talking about the immigration of 1 million people in the space of 4 years to a country when it's formed that has about 600,000 people in it. So that what happens is within the space of about 4 years, you end up with the population of the country tripling. And that means that resources need to be expended on the settlement of Jews who are coming from all different countries. Now, we recognize that very first line as Holocaust refugees, as people who were coming from DP camps as the country is open. But very quickly, we also get an enormous immigration from Arab countries as well. And when we talk about that population, the common parlance that we've come to use to talk about them is Mizrahi, meaning Eastern or Oriental. But of course, for many of those Jews, they were actually coming from the west of Israel. So it's really taking on that Orientalist idea because North Africa is to the west. So that the idea that we would call someone Eastern when they're Western really feeds into a kind of language of rhetoric that is brought from the West to describe these people. And the common kind of technical jargon we use now is MENA, Middle East and North Africa. But in Israel, the term we use is Mizrahi, and it commonly refers to Jews who came from Arab countries. So the first representations of Mizrahi women, it really begins with the very beginning of Mizrahi cinema. And we see in one of the first films ever made in 1955, Hill 24 Doesn't Answer, that the representation of an authentic local woman, her name in the character's name in this is Mizrahi, like that's actually her name, is being played by women who are really a kind of ideal Israeli female figure. And someone like Chaya Hararit, who plays this role, will then go on into major Hollywood roles in European cinema. But in those roles, she'll play some undisclosed exotic Eastern beauty. And that's sort of how Israel begins to market its own female actresses into a global stage. And during the 50s and, well, particularly the 60s, Israeli women end up having pretty high profile international careers, starting in Israeli cinema and moving out globally. And we often recognize them in James Bond films and other kinds of locations. But the two women who appeared in that 1955 film, who were actually Mizrahi, Margalit Oved and Shoshana Damari, very quickly get kicked out of the film industry. Shoshana Damari ends up with a very reputable singing career, but Margalit Oved ends up being part of a musical dance troupe and sort of leaving cinema completely. And so there isn't really a space for the representation of women who come from Mizrahi roots, even though they continue to be represented on screen by women of Ashkenazi, that is, Jews of European origin. And the most famous of these is Gila Almagor, who has a 60-year film career. She's still making things, but she ends up in these like invariable roles, continuously playing the prostitute role. And that's sort of the role that is available to Mizrahi characters for the first few years of Israeli cinema. And so the kind of life, the representation of these women is really seen from this very Ashkenazi perspective and sort of writes them off as prostitutes. What we see is the representation of the Mizrahi community more generally gets very much tied into things like this scene from Salah Shabati, which was actually taken in the parking lot of the production studio, where it's about the poverty of transit camps, that figures who are Mizrahi come from a kind of undetermined location. Are they Yemenite? Are they Moroccan? Are they Iraqi? Are they Tunisian? We don't know. They're a bit of a hodgepodge. We'll throw everything in. It'll sort of be a symbolic representation. And the men are often shown as lazy and alcoholics and patriarchal and often abusive of women. But the end of the film of these Mizrahi kind of figures always ends up with this sign of hope that they're becoming Israeli too. In the end, everybody's going to join the melting pot, everybody's going to be Israeli. And you have this very paradigmatic scene at the end of Salah Shabati where the new apartments that everybody is dreaming of are there on the horizon. And that's going to be the new hope for the future. And these images become so iconic that they can later be reused. And I'm going to show you how. So the films that get made in the 70s sort of fall into two categories for representing Mizrahim. Brekas films, which are cheap kind of comedies that are essentially trade on racial stereotypes and often are about criminality and misdirection, often leering women. Women tend to have very superficial roles. They're usually being peered at by men, or they're kind of overbearing matriarchs that they're making fun of. Or you get melodramas. And the melodramas, in a way, are more interesting because they're drawing directly on Middle Eastern cinema's own industry. And the films that some of these filmmakers were seeing being made in Iran and Iraq and Egypt and Syria. And so they're trying to make a kind of Israeli version of these. And what's particularly notable is that some of the later directors were themselves filmmakers of melodramas in Arab countries before they come to Israel. And then they remake the films that they were making abroad in Hebrew. Um, so these films have certain kinds of characteristics. We saw the Ma'bara, the refugee camp, the settlement for when they first arrived, and then the hope of the building in the future. We see a lot of pictures of deserts with camels, the kind of empty, desolate landscape as if there is nothing else beyond. And what happens is in 1986, Ram Levy makes a film called Bread. And what he's doing is he's taking those stereotypical tropes that we had come to expect from things like Salah Shabati and then really taking them apart and making social dramas. And he's saying, 20 years ago you made fun of this, but let me tell you what this really looks like. It really looks like this empty, desolate landscape. It really looks like no hope. There's one factory in town, and invariably that one factory stops operating. And when it does, the entire town becomes impoverished. Everything breaks down. There's no future for the population of the town. And it sort of becomes this internal prison. And if you think about that first image of those buildings on the horizon, well, here's that same building, but now it's become bars that are trapping the person in. This man is like dying of a hunger strike, essentially, because they're fighting for better wages. And as the title of the film, Bread, they work at a bread factory, but bread also means, income. And he's essentially starving to death as they're protesting the low wages. And so the columns themselves sort of indicate a prison, but there's also no landscape beyond. There's nothing past it. And so this is particularly represented in the image of the bus. It's one bus, it's leaving town. There's no other cars on the road. There's no vegetation. There's nothing. There is no hope. And usually in these films, the only person who's able to get out is maybe a single daughter, and she can get the bus out of town and she never returns. She goes to study in the city or she joins the army, and essentially that's her departure. That's the only future opportunity that's available to her in her life. And the men who stay behind essentially become drunks, they become involved in drugs, they're impoverished, they're criminals. There's no commerce, there's no industry, there's no way out. And we see this being used 20 years later in something like The Band's Visit. So here we are again, we're capturing the same desolate landscape. And this beautiful group of men in blue uniform, they're actually Egyptians who've come to play in an orchestra. They've been invited for a cultural tour and they get on the wrong bus. and they end up in the middle of nowhere in one of these places. And the joke about it is they were trying to go to the Beta Tikva, the House of Hope, and there is no hope here. That's sort of the end of the road, as it were. And they get there, and there's nothing. There's the one bus out of town. You can see it's going to come once a day. It dropped them off, and now they're in the wrong place. And here's our same building structures that we saw in Salah Shabati, and now they're reappearing here 40 years later, and still the landscape is desolate. And now there is a few trees, but there's not much there. And here the uniforms are really stark against that empty landscape. And here we go again. We have our road, our one road out of town, nothing coming in, nothing going out. It's very empty. And at the end, he looks back before managing to get out of town the next day on the bus and sort of looks back at this location and thinks, kind of what was this that I saw before being able to leave? And so we see it again in this film from 1994, Shur, which is the start of a change in representation. And something like The Band's Visit will follow from it. And it becomes a new kind of cinema that is seeking to really think about the history of Mizrahi representation. And what happens in this new kind of cinema is that it really focuses on women much more. And it's focusing on nostalgia, going back into a cultural space. And it's trying to say, being made by filmmakers who are first or second generation immigrants who are thinking about their own homes. Like, what was life like for them? Now these filmmakers are themselves Mizrahi, and they're able to say, what was it about our lives? Like, let's try and capture some of the color, some of the beauty, some of the romance, move away from those Breakfast films, which were these superficial comedies that were really demeaning and stereotypical, and think about what was going on in our lives. The thing is, while in many ways it's trying to capture something about the essential world, it also ends up spending a great deal of time in representing these Mizrahi women. Like, now they have personalities, they're people, but somehow there's this constant need to represent them as engaged in a mystical alternative world. And they get constantly associated with witchcraft. And so now they're not so much whores, but now they're witches. And we see this over and over. Here's a little clip. Do you get sound? Is the sound working? Helene, can you hear the sound?
No, I cannot.
Okay. So what you have is this, so then I can talk over it. What you have is these representations of mystical ceremonies, magical ceremonies that are telling you about an alternative way of life. And on one hand, you have these women who are engaged in witchcraft. And at the other hand, you have the father in the background who's listening to religious prayers being chanted. And so this is a magical incantation to protect her while she goes out to work. Everybody say amen. Right. So what we see constantly in films like this is a return, a kind of nostalgia towards an alternative way of life, a world that is sort of remembered in half fragments by the filmmakers, but it also becomes very exoticized and almost orientalized. And we see that in things like these ceremonies, and here, even the photograph angle, the coming from the floor, looking up, looking at what essentially looks like a ghost dancing as part of a ceremony, is somehow foreign. And we get this in a lot. And in this scene, I'm just going to play this very quick scene. It's two of the characters who are in love, but couldn't really come together. And it's just a small moment from this film. Oh, And so, in this sense, Shur is black magic, the black magic of the Mizrahi community. And the joke is it psychology or is it Shur? And is Shur this black magic sort of how Mizrahim engage in like life decisions? Now, with all of that, we also get this exoticization that isn't about the witchcraft, but is about colorfulness. Somehow it's rich, it's vibrant, the music is good, everybody's dancing, everybody's happy, there's a rejoicing over food. And again, this is really set in contrast to a kind of Ashkenazi portrayal, which is very staid, very unsentimental, very unenthusiastic. The joke is always that the food is terrible, that the table is small, and that there is very little warmth in the family environment. And so this is being set up as a contrast to it. And we see these kinds of ceremonies. And here again is Argila Almagor, who has migrated from being the whore to being the Mizrahi matriarch. And in 2003, this was taken to an extreme in the film The Witch Sima Vaknin, which plays into all of the ethnic stereotypes of Mizrahim. Sima becomes a witch and begins to do crazy spells. But it also begins to get at a political consciousness that really comes to the fore after 1977, when the elections are won by Menachem Begin, who is, though himself an Ashkenazi, is supported with this groundswell of support by Mizrahim on this right-wing platform. And it's really the overturning of the first 30 years of Israeli consciousness, which are very socialist and labor and European in their kind of control of the hegemony. And so now the Mizrahim are coming to the fore, and as the film progresses, it becomes more and more extreme and kind of feeds into a racism that is being identified with Mizrahi right-wing support, so that the Mizrahim are themselves shown as racist and small-minded and fanatical. And the end of the film kind of ends up with this crazy chanting. But what we also see is all the different sectors of Israeli society. At the same time, we see the religious the religious Zionists. We see gays. We see the Mizrahim alongside the army. Well, here we have the military. And the idea here is like together they are furthering this extremist view and the right wing view of the country. And so this cinema that began to reclaim a Mizrahi cultural heritage was renamed kind of New Mizrahi Cinema. And though it doesn't have any single point of identification, there are general themes that run through this. It was trying to challenge stereotypes. It's trying to capture life at the periphery and the immigration experience, and it's very heavily nostalgic, often with this black magic kind of interwoven into it. But we also see an increasing exploration of gender and religion. And in those early films that I've shown you, things like Shur, gender is really the religion of women is this black magic, whereas the religion of men is traditional Hebrew orthodoxy. And the religion of women is often practiced in a kind of Judeo-Arabic or sometimes in French. And that also marks the separation between the groups. So then we get a film like Turn Left at the End of the World, and it's a classic example of New Mizrahi cinema. And here we have like all of these same tropes again: the road to nowhere in the middle of the desert, the empty, barren landscape. Here we don't even have camels. The one factory in town, which is now closed, and there's a strike going on. And here the smashed bottles kind of represent the end of hope, the end of industry, and the end of this way of life. Time passes and nothing is changing and nothing is improving. But at the same time, here we have the same things. We have the color, the variety, and look, it's a culture of women. And we begin to see women more and more placed at the center of these new Mizrahi films. But we begin to get a more sophisticated attempt to differentiate between the different groups inside the film. So here we have this Indian woman who is in the same location, and yet she comes from an entirely different cultural tradition, not just as an Indian woman, but also a different colonization experience that's very British in its interest. And that affects things like the sports her husband plays, which are cricket. And she's paralleled with someone like the North African Mizrahi woman who speaks French and comes from a French colonial history. And together they end up, the Mizrahi woman joins, the Indian woman joins forces and has to go and see the Berber woman to get her witchcraft, to get her husband back, who's fallen in love with this very beautiful um, French North African woman. And so we have these multiple layers in an attempt to differentiate between different kinds of Mizrahi. And yet we're still relying on some of those tropes about sexual availability. And even though we're not calling her a whore anymore, that's kind of how she's set up in her behavior. We're still having the black magic. We're still seeing the witchcraft being used. And we still get the one bus leaving town. There's nothing in any direction. And again, it's the one girl who manages to leave. So what we see is like a real explosion in the flourishing of films that showcase Mizrahi women's experience, particularly even more than men's. And here we have Orange People, which is about a Tunisian historical family experience. We have Shalosh Imaot, which is about an Egyptian family experience. And we have the trio To Take a Wife, The 7 Days and Get, which are looking at one family and the breakdown of a marriage over the course of the 3 films, and Vivian's attempt to divorce her husband. And she's really juxtaposing her cultural values with the religious institutional systems that prevent her divorce from happening. And so there's one film which I really love, which to me is very much an exception to the rule of how these films operate, which is My Beautiful Sister. And it starts to challenge the stereotypes. So here we have the man waiting for the one bus, and I'm just going to play you a little clip showing you sort of what happens as he waits for his one bus out of town, which we've, come to see. So first of all, the fact that there are cars going past is already new. And then instead of the bus, we get a bicycle. And so suddenly we're like, wait, what? You're dead already? It disrupts all of our conventions. And one of the things I love about this film is already we can see the ocean in the background. Like it's already not the middle of the desert. We're not in the middle of nowhere. And there's tons of people and it's very alive. But we also have this other narrative going on where, wait, am I dead? And now we're at his funeral. And it's a real contrast. There's much more interesting play on those stereotypes and thinking about the stereotypes in very different ways. And we have it happening in multiple ways. One of the things that is at the center of the film is the breakdown of a relationship between 2 sisters over the fact that one of them married an Arab who is not, and there's a whole question, well, aren't we from the same place? Don't we speak the same language? What does it mean to say he's an Arab and we're not Arab? Of course we're Arab. We speak Judeo-Arabic. We understand the Arabic that he's speaking. How is it that we see them as the enemy? And again, the young man, instead of being a criminal and a drug addict, is shown like as entrepreneurial and kind and funny and very much engaged with his family in positive ways. And again, we have the sisters finally coming together in death. but looking out over the sea, there's no desert, there's no camel. We're thinking about what are the other ways of reading this cultural heritage. And at the end, they're sitting together. They're sitting on the floor, sitting Shiva, which is a pattern that we've seen in other films. But here, the Mizrahi family is sitting together with the Arab in this moment of commemoration and grieving. And it's a kind of different recognition. It's one that sees a larger historical and social context and a place for bridges and relationship building. And so I now we come to the women's balcony, and we can see how it's coming out of a heritage of a real evolution, one that is placing women's lives and women's experience at the center. But it's no longer in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere. It's being set in the city. The women aren't passive, sort of marginal figures of nostalgia and history, but are active in fighting for their rights and for their identity. And their religion isn't a mystical witchcraft religion, but is in fact the same religion as the men. And in those ways, it's really overturning many of the stereotypes that had dominated in our understanding of the Mizrahi representation and arguing for a different kind of filmmaking for Mizrahi men. So, having set that up, I'm now looking forward to talking and really thinking about the film that you watch. Let me stop the screen share.
Rachel, thank you so much for situating the women's balcony in Israeli cinematic history, and also for giving us quite the watch list. Really, really appreciate those remarks. I want to start with asking you. You said at the very beginning how delighted you were because The Women's Balcony is one of your favorite films. And I have to tell you, I share your delight. When I was first invited to moderate, I was ecstatic because it is also one of my favorite films. And I guess I want to hear a little bit from you why it's one of your favorite films. And also, why do you think it has been so popular, both within Israel and outside of Israel? And the filmmakers, and in particular the writer, Shlomit Nahama, was blown away by how popular it was. And actually I think it was the director Emil Ben Shimon, who at some point was at a festival and there was a line that he could not see the end of, and he thought, this can't be for this film. And so I want to hear from you. Why is it your favorite? And why do you think it's been so amazingly popular?
So I think it did something that hadn't been going on before with Mizrahi films. There was something in the Mizrahi films that was always like, look at this specimen in a bottle. This is different from our lives. You don't know this world. I'm going to tell you about this world, but you're far from this world, and it's exotic and it's different, but it's not your world. And I think that what the women's balcony really captured is a much more essential truth about human relations, about life inside a marriage, the push pull dynamics of human affection for people, and the forces that play on those relationships, but also human weakness, like how we as people sort of succumb to various kinds of pressures, and what it takes to find ourselves again when things go wrong. And the group is really reacting to a single trauma the loss of their synagogue, the loss of their community, the loss of their rabbi, in different ways that are related to their personalities, but also they come to see what the greater loss will be, and so then they come back together as a community. And I think those speak to much more universal issues than we saw in any of the other films I presented. And even when we have moments of affection, like we have in Shkuru, this couple coming together, in the end, we also see that their life is a bit of a dead end trope. Here he had this opportunity to study at the Sorbonne, and he's giving it up to marry her and have babies, and that's the good, happy ending. And in a way, we can say, well, it's nice in the moment of the film, but in the larger scheme of things, that's a bit sad. Like it's back to the you can't leave, you can't get on the bus, there's nowhere to go mentality. And I think Marco Carmel really breaks that a little bit with Achoti Yafa, My Beautiful Sister. But it's a really unknown film. And I remember seeing it at a festival in 2011 and just thinking it was the most beautiful film, and then discovering that no one else had ever seen it. And it had the moment wasn't quite right for what he was trying to do. And by the time the women's balcony appeared, um, My Beautiful Sister, it's very beautiful. It's also very magical, realistic. It's very abstract. One sister spends 3 days talking to the dead sister who's awake and wandering around, and they're having fights. Like, it's beautiful, it's clever, but I think it again still feels exotic, different, alien. Whereas with the women's balcony, it feels like our lives too, even if our lives aren't identical to that. But we understand where that's coming from. We understand what happened.
Okay. Yes. And is that why you like it so much?
I think that's why it just appealed to audiences more generally. I really like the wide variety of female representation. I like that we weren't left with one or two women or a family dynamic where, like, here's the matriarch and here's the daughter and here's the granddaughter, and they kind of can't speak to each other. But here, what you get is, there's nothing worse than seeing a film and saying, does this woman have no friends? Like, what women live in a world where they don't know other women, where they aren't part of a female community that is separate from everything else, that they don't have a best friend on speed dial that they talk to 8 times a day, or a daughter that they're really close to. There's always some other female. And you watch these films and you're like, that's nice. But what woman is like that? And this film really got at the fights that women have, the breakdown of friendship, the variety, that it didn't traffic in stereotypes. And it was so nice to see that, and to see someone really thinking, like, what do women actually like, and not what do we think women are like.
Yeah. I think for me, I think two of I agree with everything you said, and the diversity of the women's community is, and the intense friendships, which also means, sometimes intense arguments. I think is just really an exciting part of the film. And you talked about, life within a marriage. And I've been thinking about, life within different sorts of marriage. And that's always, that's appealing about the film. I think for me, two things that really have excited me about the film. Um, the first one is you have observant Jews wrestling with feminism. And it's no longer orthodoxy versus feminism. The debate is going to be about feminism within orthodoxy. And I think that, at least for me, that crosses over into, the US tradition. Last week, we had the treat of seeing Paula Iselt, and she was talking about Under God, but if you know her first film, 93 Queen, you know that that is very much about, feminism within Orthodoxy. And I think as sort of a corollary of that, um, there's a sense of a revisioning of Jewish masculinity, and that men need to situate themselves in relationship to feminism. It's not only a woman question,
Right.
it's also a question for the men. And I think that's very exciting, which gets me right to one of the questions in the chat. Ellen Cole is asking you to talk a little bit about the role of Rabbi David, who is trying to put women, who is trying to excise women from the synagogue and from religious life, as he heralds the Torah scroll. So why don't you talk a little bit about and do some of the analysis that Ellen is asking
So,
about.
right, I think it's interesting because we see that as a push against feminism, but I think in many ways it's also about the erasure of different cultural and religious traditions. And I think in a way that's even more powerful in the film because it's speaking to something that's captured in other places as well, but not so well articulated, which is the dominant forms of orthodoxy, the people who control the largest institutions, who control the money, who control the reins, don't see these ranges in their practice. And so for them, it becomes these areas of red lines of like, oh, well, they must be doing it wrong. Their cultural tradition doesn't have value. So, and we see it with the Ethiopian Jewish community as well, where there was a point at which people were forcing Ethiopians to convert because their form of Judaism somehow didn't align with a state understanding. And particularly in Israel, where there is no separation between state and religion. There are all of the life cycle institutions, marriage, divorce, burial, recognitions of birth in meaningful ways, birth ceremonies, naming ceremonies. All of those things happen in a religious framework. And Christians get theirs, and Muslims get theirs, and Jews get theirs. And if you happen to be of a tradition or a religion that isn't catered for by these normative practices, we don't even know where to bury you. You come to Israel and you're Buddhist, where are we putting you in the ground? Like who owns that plot of land that you're going into? Who's officiating at your religious ceremony so that you can be married? How do you get divorced in a system like that? And it's speaking to it's doing it very subtly because it's not explicit that we don't see them in these formal court spaces, but it's speaking to something that has been happening and feels very oppressive in Israel, particularly for women, that there are very specific understandings of the culture. And so the rabbi is trying to force them into a set of practices which looks like he's taking over the synagogue, but it's a much sharper, more critical political point that he's making about state institutions which are forcing different groups of Jews to adhere to certain kinds of practices. And we see that in things like women of the wall movement. There are women should be able to engage in various kinds of feminist practice related to their Judaism and the abuse that they receive, both sanctioned and unsanctioned, that are sort of preventing those moves forward. And so, again, that's a more contentious issue. This is a more palatable way and a more hidden way to say the same kind of message. And you talked about like the fight of feminism in this film, and like men have to kind of come to understand that feminism too. And I think it's also secular Jewish feminists had a hard time getting their head around the idea that Orthodox women could be feminists. And that too is a shift in culture. And it works better in making some of these points in the Mizrahi community, which has always been represented as more traditional, has more engaged in traditions of religious practice, even as they were less divided by like purely secular kind of socialist labor movement or ultra orthodox kind of black hats living in Mersherim. And so when you get the Mizrahi community, there was always a greater understanding in cinema. They kind of covered a wider spectrum of traditionalism, like Judaism light, maybe. And so this pushback against institutions that are arguing that, well, that Judaism isn't valuable is also kind of being baked in here. So the film's very clever, and it feels like a cute romantic comedy in some ways, but it's really smart in getting at these much bigger social issues that are taking place in Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. The scene that automatically came to mind, and it's one of the few, it's one of the, I understand it, especially within your analysis of state institutions. But I have to say, as a viewer, the scene that I'm about to talk about feels like a bit of a misstep in what is otherwise, I think, in many ways, a really radical film. Um, the moment when Eddie's husband uh, says, I am not a righteous, he's talking to the young boy's father and says, look, he's going to see things in my shop that are going to take him out of your bubble. Maybe he shouldn't be here. And he says, I am not a righteous man and I never will be. And that is one of those moments that I felt like was a capitulation to the hierarchy of practices, that he's almost internalized definitions of righteousness. So he will say, I am not righteous, when he looks to me to be considerably more righteous.
But that's the point. I think but it's also a joke about who judges righteousness. And the man who says
Absolutely.
he's righteous is never the righteous man, right? And so it's like, and I think that it's also right. He's saying, this child is going to see things in my space, and I will not hide them for you. I will not pretend they don't exist. And in the ultra Orthodox community, they exist as well, but there is more pretense about their presence, which is damaging in all kinds of other ways. And so I think like that is the mark of his righteousness. And so I
That
understand why you see it as a misstep, and I totally see your reading of it as capitulation. But I would say I think it's cleverer than that. I think it's him saying, you want to go live in your bubble, live in your bubble. I live in the world, and that you imagine a world that doesn't really exist. And if you want to keep him trapped in that world, then you can't send him out to me.
Yeah, I very much see that. And I think, I think I think in many ways it's the difference in some ways it's the difference between character and film.
Right.
I mean,
Right. But also he doesn't feel the need to fight the man about his son. There's an argument to be made where he could have been more aggressive, and he could have said, how are you raising a child in a world where he has no contact with these things? And I don't think that's like, what would that have given anyone? What would that have made better? He's not an aggressive man, and he's a kind man. And that kindness, I think, is what really shines. and really contrast him again with the rabbi with his models of supposed honesty and righteousness. And here he is, like corrupt, stealing money and doing whatever.
Yes, absolutely. Have you taught the film? And if so, how did your students respond?
Oh my God, everybody loves this film. I remember first seeing it because I was on a screening committee for a film festival, and then taking my parents and saying, "This is the film I'm taking you to. Like, this is the film you need to see." And so I think that it has this kind of universal truth to it that just really speaks to people in really meaningful ways. And there are tons of little things. The very first opening credits, when they're coming down the stairs, and each of the men is carrying something, like everybody's helping. And then later, when the burden really falls on the women and the men kind of abdicate all responsibility, and they're like, well, this is women's work. And they're like, in what world? Like, you eat in my house, you help carry, you help cook, you help carry, like, what is this sudden reinvention of our 40 years of marriage where we've shared these dynamics and all of a sudden you're reimagining what our relationship is. And so I think that that's even more than the men asking the women to take on more religious practices or practices that were alien to them. The abdication of partnership is why it feels so hostile. And this attempt to draw patriarchal boundaries about the role of people in a family. And that's what the women are pushing back against. And it's not just that they're fighting for their place in the synagogue, they're fighting for their place in the family. And there's this fabulous opening moment at the bar mitzvah when the rabbi says to him, "When are you getting the window fixed?" And he says, and the rabbi kind of quotes at him, he says, "We hasten to fix God's house." And then you have this rabbi kind of delaying the process and delaying the process. And he doesn't want to fix God's house. And he certainly doesn't want to fix it so women can be in it. And so again, you have the contrasting visions of religious meaning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, well, so I guess based on that, I'd like to hear you talk about a couple of things. Number one, sort of food in the movie and food as the language of love. Um, and then the other that I think is fascinating is the use of windows and the use of doors in the film. So I'd love to hear you riff on those.
So I'm going to do it backwards. The use of windows and doors, like what really struck me as well, is the colors of the doors, particularly the very opening. Though they're evoking that Middle Eastern history, those blues, which are speaking to things like the evil eye. Like, why is the door blue? It's to protect you from the evil eye. And so it's really kind of taking the rhetoric, the mythology of Mizrahi culture and putting it in like real ways in the space and catching that cultural Orientalism, but without exoticizing it, without making it foreign and weird. And I think the part of the thing about the windows and the doors and the balconies, right? Because there's they live upstairs and downstairs, so you're going upstairs. You have these multiple tiered layers all the time, which is such a contrast again with the desert and the factory and the abandonment. It's like, oh, what happens when we live in a community on top of each other? Is the cinematography. Like, let's not forget that these films are beautiful, that Israeli cinema has come a long way since 1986 when we see the quality of the filmmaking of Bread and we look at something like The Band's Visit on the women's balcony, and you just want to watch the cinematography. It's just so gorgeous, and the framing of scenes, like what do you get on camera at any moment, and where the camera is positioned, and what you actually like. You want to take the film and then like just take a shot, and then 3 seconds later take another one and take another one, and then just look at these moments of pause and how everything is so beautifully crafted in those spaces. And again, it's about, there's a metaphor in here about having a window, or a bird's eye view, or a balcony view of like the world around you, and how our views are always only from a specific angle, that we can only see things from our particular vantage point. And that metaphor is in here, but I think some of it is just about the deliciousness of how it looks on screen. And moving from deliciousness to food, I think that you have all of these conversations about food, like the little boy who's turning on the urn and they're trying to give him the compote, the food the girl makes for the boy, the food, that all the different kinds of food, the food that they eat as a family, the Pesach meal where they end up sitting outside. And I think there is multiple layers in here. There's food as community, as social discourse, as how we relate, as how we function together. Food as holiness, like how we use food to sanctify religious occasions and to recognize the meaning of Jewish experience. We also have food, like the withholding of food that happens, but we also have food as a religious control, right? When the kashrut isn't enough to meet people's standards, like I will no longer eat your food, and how that is used as a way to create boundaries and barriers that isolate and alienate people. And we see that again, that's a criticism happening at multiple levels in Israel, where you have all of this conversation about kashrut. And so, is the Beit Din religious enough for you? Can you only eat in certain kinds of restaurants? Is the kashrut industry really a racket? And you now have kosher restaurants that are like have their own kind of counter kashrut movement, where it's a kosher restaurant, but it doesn't get its supervision from the Beit Din because it refuses to play by their kind of, bribery standards, and it's really about kind of getting money out of places. And so there's this whole counter movement in parts of Israel about a restaurant being kosher but not certified. And so what does that mean? And it's also like the idea that by controlling food, we're controlling barriers and access and relationship. And one of the things I teach my students is about a writer called Esther Ben David, who was writing Jewish fiction in India. If you haven't read her, I recommend it highly. They're very beautiful stories. But one of the things that's really unique about them is because she's engaging with Hindu communities and they're vegetarian, they can eat together across cultural lines. Like Jews can eat with Hindus in ways that Jews usually can't. Like one of the ways Jews separate themselves from the communities around them is because they can't eat with them, right? You can't eat, and not just because of what you can't eat, but you can't even sit with non-Jews to eat meals because the food wasn't kosher. And I always tell people the story about herring. Like one of the reasons that Jews in Eastern Europe ate herring was because it was salted in a barrel. And if you were traveling, you could buy it because it didn't have to have, there wasn't a problem of it not being kosher. So you could eat it out of a newspaper as you were traveling, and it made a meal for a Jew who was in transit, who was in trade, who was whatever. It was one of the few things you could have from a non-Jew's stand. And so I think that there's like that piece of it as well, where what does it mean when you put in these barriers where you can't come together? And you see it with and then you asked about food as love, and you see it with the fruit salad. That fruit salad is like a bi-directional expression of love. and it's like the part that the man controls in that relationship, and it's his way of sharing it too.
Yeah, great. Well, we are at 8 o'clock, and so I want to thank you so very much,
Thank you.
Rachel, for your presentation and the discussion. And I think that Betsy has some news about next week and beyond.
Thank you both so much. This was such a lovely conversation. I learned so much about um, Mizrahi Jews in Israeli film, and also what a lovely way to think about the women's balcony itself. I love thinking about the blue and the visuals of it. So thank you, Helene. Thank you, Rachel. This was a marvelous conversation. For everyone else, and thank you to the audience, of course, for joining us and for your questions. Please join us again next week at the same time, same link, as we discuss the classic Barbra Streisand film Funny Girl about another iconic Jewish entertainer, Fanny Brice, with theater scholar and director Barry Gallis. That will be the last of our film club entries for this year so far. But starting in March, we will have another round of book talks. You can find more at our events page. It has the list of all the authors we'll be speaking with. And we hope that you'll join us for as many of them as you can. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening. And thank you again, Helene and Rachel. It was a pleasure. Good night.
Yeah. Good night. And the book club looks wonderful.
Thank
It looks like a really good selection.
Thank you. I'm excited about it. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
You
Good
too.
night.